This is Ralph Emery again, and the next interview you're going to hear was done July 25th in the year 2000 at my office in Nashville. And I was doing my book, my fourth book, this one called 50 Years Down a Country Road, celebrating my 50 years in broadcasting. I asked my buddy Tom T. Hall to come by my office and sit down and tell me the stories of his life. He, being the storyteller, did a marvelous job. I think you will enjoy this tape. I call it a work tape. It's a bit of the research that goes into putting a book together. And my associate, Patsy Bale Cox, will be heard from time to time. She will chime in occasionally with a question. And we're in my office, and you may hear an extraneous sound or two, but we're actually not doing this for broadcast. We're just doing it for research. So let's spend some time, some very nice, casual time with Tom T. Hall. The first biggie, The Ballad of $40.
Yeah.
And I remember that as being a song took place in the graveyard because you used to mow graveyards, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. When I was a kid, my aunt gave me a job mowing cemeteries in the summertime.
Tell me about that song.
You know, I always had this, naturally, I couldn't have made a living otherwise, but I had a good ear. My father was a good storyteller, and I loved good stories, maybe from my father. And I had a way of I was a kind of a dreamy-like kid, and I'd watch, and pick up on attitudes and dispositions and parts of culture that everybody else was aware of, but didn't have any notion of making anything of it. But I wanted, I remember a good story. So I was my father being a preacher too, and preached at a lot of funerals and that sort of thing, and me hanging around the church and all that. But I had this job working in a cemetery, and I got to see a lot of funerals because I would have to, of course, stop mowing grass. You couldn't run a lawnmower when the funeral's going on. But I got to noticing, and all of that whole cultural thing there with my father in the church and people dying and me working in the graveyard, that a fellow could be a real SOB.
Excuse me?
Could be a real SOB while he was alive. Then after he died, it kind of amazed me that he would take on this aura of sainthood. And of course, people do that. They have respect for the deceased, and so that stuck in my mind pretty much. And I remember I was there, and I stopped, and the fellows were out there digging the grave, before the service. They were digging this grave, and they had a couple of bottles of moonshine and a couple of six-packs of beer, and they were drinking beer and digging this guy's grave. And at that time it was done, you'd kind of volunteer to dig the guy's grave if you were sort of like a pallbearer, because they didn't have the big backhoes and things they got now. Or
Boy, that's got to be a good friend.
Yeah.
To agree to dig his grave.
Yeah, but that's the way it was done out in the country. So they were telling stories about him, and one fella mentioned, that he didn't want to bring it up to the widow or anything, and it was a lost cause, but the guy owed him $40, a great guy and all that, and he's passed on, but he kind of wished he'd left a note with his estate that, he gave this guy $40, and he was reluctant to go, say, hey, Fred owed me $40. And it could have been from a poker game or whatever, who knows.
You didn't have a middle name, did you?
No, because my father wanted to call me Elijah, Thomas Elijah Hall. And so when the nurse came in and said, what is this child's name? My mother was in charge of the paperwork, says, Thomas Hall. I said, what's his middle initial? She says, he has no middle initial, just Thomas Hall. And because she was afraid when I grew up they'd call me Lige, because there were other people in the neighborhood who were called Elijah, and they just shortened it to Lige. And so that was a great conspiracy, and my father went to his grave thinking that my middle name was Elijah.
He never looked at your birth certificate.
No, he never looked at all the paperwork. He just assumed that he had gotten his way, and my name was Thomas Elijah Paul.
And then you put the T on, I suppose.
Jimmy Key did.
It's
See, everybody who went to the Jimmy Key and worked with Jimmy Key, he'd give him a middle initial. His name was, he had a front initial, E. Jimmy Key. Remember? And E. Jimmy Key thought initials were important, so when Jimmy Newman went to work with Jimmy Newman, went to work with Jimmy Key put a C in there.
for Cajun.
Yeah, Jimmy C. Newman.
What did he do for Dudley?
He didn't give Dudley a middle initial, but when Jeannie C. Riley recorded Harper Valley PTA, Jimmy Key was instrumental in getting the C put in Jeannie C. Riley's name. Although her name probably was Jeannie Constance Riley.
I don't know what her middle name is. I know that Jimmy Newman is Yves. It's a French name. Yeves. You
Right.
wrote Hello Vietnam,
Right,
the Watergate Blues.
right.
I assume this was because you had something to say about those events.
Well, when the Vietnam War came about, when I wrote that song, it was not a controversial conflict. There were nobody marching or anything. It was, but I'd given some thought to war songs, and which was sort of a phenomenon. You know, Chet Hagan, who wrote the CMA award shows for a number of years, he and I used to talk about. They used to record a lot of war songs and disease songs. You know, disease of the month. You know, the Lumbago Blues, and they had.
I think Jimmy Rogers started some of that, didn't he?
Maybe
Singing about
so.
TB Blues.
TB Blues.
Yeah.
Parkinson's shake.
And so I was very much aware of that, having studied the history of what they had written. So, and I was writing songs 9 to 5. When I got to Nashville, I had the old American work ethic thing in mind, because I'd come off the farm, gone into the military, gone to school, and then I came to Nashville, and I was pretty well trained. So I said, if I'm writing songs for a living, I suppose I get up in the morning and write songs for a, considerable length of time. And I had a typewriter and a tape recorder, and I had a desk, and I would go there and write till long in the afternoon. And then on Fridays, I would turn in my tapes and get my little draw, that I had coming. So naturally, some politics entered in there, and I heard, but a good story about the Hello Vietnam, 2 stories, and I'll make them short, is NBC was saying Vietnam. That's just how new the war was. David Brinkley was calling it the Vietnam War, and CBS, Walter Cronkite, was calling it the Vietnam War. And I'm watching the news, and I said, this is a war song, and Nam will rhyme with mom, and Nam rhymes more with damn than anything else, so if I'm going to write this song, I'm going to stick with Walter Cronkite. So when I wrote the song, I wrote it Hello Vietnam, and it turned out Cronkite won the pronunciation contest, and it turned out to be Vietnam.
What about the Watergate Blues?
Watergate Blues is a takeoff on the old, where McKinley hollered, McKinley squalled. Doctor said, McKinley, I can't find the ball, you're bound to die, you're bound to die. The old White House Blues song.
Mm-hmm.
And I always loved that song.
Tom, did you hang out with that? I mean, that was the time when they were all hanging out at Tootsie's and Roger Miller and everybody.
Oh,
Did
yeah,
you
I was
hang
in
out
that
with
crowd.
That crowd?
I was in that crowd.
And Willie was here?
Willie was here, and Roger, and we used to write a song in the morning, and nobody thought about anybody stealing anything or any copyrights or anything. You'd sing it for somebody that night. You're all sitting around drinking beer, singing your new songs you just wrote. Nobody thought about losing any of them, and I don't know if anybody ever did. I saw Willie on a golf course one day, and I was coming up one hole, he's going down the other, and we yelled at one another, how you doing? Pretty good. I asked Willie, I said, you writing any songs? Yeah, I wrote one this morning. I said, what's it about? He said, oh, about this old boy and this old girl. I said, okay, you're doing the right thing. That seems to be selling pretty good these days.
When you were a young songwriter and you got to meet other songwriters, did somebody say, "Hey, Tom, you got to go with me to Tootsie's. That's the way to do it. We'll meet some stars down there."
Now, when you came to Nashville, you went straight to Tootsie's. You were never invited.
So, in other words, the word was out.
Yeah.
That was the place.
In fact, I had been to Nashville before. I moved here, naturally. And I always go to Tootsie's. It was kind of the unofficial backstage of the Opry, of course, and you could hang out there and see some of the stars and pitch them a song.
You said Jimmy Carter was sitting on the bed talking to you, and he had his old jogging suit on, and here he was, the President of the United States?
That's one of my favorite stories. I was in the Lincoln bedroom, and I'm sitting on the Lincoln's bed drinking a beer. And because there's a little refrigerator down the hall, and I said, just go down there if you need a sandwich or like anybody else's house, I'd gone down there and gotten me a beer, and the president had been out jogging around the White House lawn, I guess. He came in and plopped down in the chair. Said, are you all having a good time? And Miss Dixie and I were there, and I said, we're having a great time. I said, Mr. President, this is a great day in the life of a country boy. And he looked up and said, are you talking about me?
Speaking of stories, I want to get this on tape. And you've told me any number of times, but it's my favorite, one of my favorite Tom T. Hall stories. That's the Ritter story on the plane to Asia, telling you about the wonders of the Japanese culture, that sort of thing. And Mrs. Ritter is sitting next to him.
Yeah, I love this story. Dorothy Ritter was our diplomatic attaché.
Okay, you were on a UN tour.
Right, this was a UN tour for the children of Bangladesh. We went to Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, and Japan, and did shows.
With Connie Smith and
Leroy Van Dyke and Tex, of course, and some other people were on the tour. And we're sitting on an airplane. Dorothy's sitting by the window. Tex is sitting out on the aisle next to her, and I'm right across the aisle from Tex. And Dorothy's going through she's taking her diplomatic attaché duties very seriously. And Tex is leaning across the aisle talking to me, and we were on our way to Japan, flying to Japan from Hong Kong, I suppose. Tex says, you know, Tom T., he says, have you ever been to Japan? I said, no, sir, I haven't. He said, you're going to love it. He said, and you're going to love the women in Japan. He said, you know, I don't know if you know this, but the women in Japan, unlike American women, Japanese women are taught from birth how to please a man. This is their great ambition in life, is to please a man. And the Japanese women are the most sensual and most sensitive. And then he looked out of the corner of his eye, and Dorothy was sitting staring at him. Women in the world. And he looked at me and he said, so I've been told.
That's great. What did you tell me a while back? A little speech you were doing on stage about Reba, and you were comparing the money she was making today versus what you did in '74.
1974 was my biggest year in show business. I made more money in 1974 than I had at any other time, before or since. And I looked at the figure, and it suddenly dawned on me that I'd read an article in the newspaper that morning about a Reba McEntire concert in Kansas City. Reba McEntire made as much money in one night, more money in one night than I made in 1974.
And you were one of the hottest things in.
I was the hottest thing. That was my big year. I had 5 CMA nominations. I had 2 #1 records. I was touring. I had I was doing network television and selling Chevy trucks, and my big year. And Reba made more money in one night than I made in the whole year.
Doesn't seem fair, does it?
They moved the decimal points around a lot.
Tom, on a more recent note, tell me about Little Bitty, the song you wrote for Alan Jackson.
Yeah, I was on tour in Australia. I love to walk over there, so I got up from my hotel one morning and I walked. I usually walk, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles, about 2 or 3 miles out and then 2 or 3 miles back. Try not to get lost. And I walked past this little house, and it struck me as being sort of American because it was a little white house, 5-room house, and had a little white fence around it and a little dog in the yard and some toys on the porch, and they had a kid. And I looked at that and I said, that is a little composite of the whole human circumstance. And there was a little car there in the driveway. And then the thought dawned on me that it was all right to be little bitty. I don't know whether little. And so as I was walking out, I started humming this song and writing it. And then on the way back to the hotel, I was humming it and writing it. And I went back to the hotel and I got a cup of coffee. And this waitress brought the coffee and sat it down. And I said, oh, by the way, does little bitty mean anything in Australia, that expression? She said, oh, yes, it's something very tiny. I said, good. Then I've got me an international song here, But the danger of that thing is, and this is true of all songwriting, I put that song in a drawer because I couldn't find the last verse. I wrote the song and I couldn't find out how to end it. And of course, in the song, it starts all over again, which is the way life goes. But at that time, I didn't know that, so the song just went down to the bottom there and stuck. It wouldn't end. And I threw it in the drawer and threw a bunch of paper clips and old stuff in on top of it. So I'm down in Florida 2 years later. And there's a little studio down there, and I'm going to go over and demo a song with them. They want to play some music. And I only had one song. I said, I got to find another song. If I go over there with one song, everybody's going to be disappointed because they got all these musicians and things, and they want to make. So I got to digging through the drawer, and I found the Little Bitty song. And I pulled it out and looked at it and immediately knew how to end it. It started all over again. Life cycles. Mm-hmm. Well, I scribbled that on the bottom of it and went over and demoed it. And of course, then Alan Jackson heard it, and the rest of it is in part of the music. But I don't know, that thing would still be in a drawer if I hadn't been going over there doing that demo. Or either that, it had been emptied out and thrown away.
You remember, Tom, when you used to go out in search of songs and you would just go alone, go into town, sit in the bars or wherever?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I used to, one of my best albums, I think my best album I ever did was called In Search of a Song, which is the title of the song tells you what I was up to. And I think I did some liner notes that said something about that. But I used to get in a car and go out to an intersection of the interstate and try to determine which way the wind was blowing and just go in that direction. And then I'd get off the interstate and take the back roads. And I'd eat in little mom and pop restaurants and stay in small motels and go out and just sit around and, drink a beer in a little local tavern and see people and, eavesdrop on conversations or maybe sit down and talk to some guy. But now, see, this is before I made records. I made a lot of records. And my notoriety and the publicity and my picture got out in the TV, and because somebody would walk in and say, "Aren't you Tom T. Hall?" And then that would ruin the whole thing. In fact, the last trip I went on, I was in Virginia someplace, and I stopped in a little town, checked in a motel. And it was a chain motel, I don't know, Ramada Inn or Holiday Inn or something. And they said, "Aren't you Tom T. Hall?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And they said, "Well, what brings you to you know, wherever I was. I don't remember where I was because I just pulled off the road when I got tired. It didn't matter. That was part of the program. And I said, well, I'm just out looking for some songs. And she said, oh, well, that's interesting. And then I signed in and went to bed. And when I got up the next morning, there's about 25 songwriters in the lobby.
Tom, at one time, didn't everyone in Olive Hill, Kentucky, your hometown, think you were writing about them?
Yeah, and in many instances, they were right. Because I wrote biographically, you know. I changed their names and, you know, and all of that. But I always kept enough of it, you know, to keep it real in my mind. There's a little songwriting trick in that. For instance, Clayton Delaney was not Clayton's real name from the year Clayton Delaney died song. Clayton was, actually, I did it this way. He lived on Delaney Road.
The guy did.
The guy did. And so I called him Clayton Delaney. I named him after the road instead of his real name. But in my mind, the way I was writing the song, that kept it pure and kept it right there. In my mind, it was in the same area, in the same geography.
Clayton Delaney was a real person.
He was a real guy, yeah.
But Clayton, I guess, was a local, we'll call him a troubadour.
Yeah, but the unique thing, he wasn't just a picker. The unique thing about Clayton was that he didn't, and you would understand this, maybe the general public wouldn't, but a country singer will sit down, and if they sing a Lefty Frizzell song at that time, they would try to sing it like Lefty.
Mm-hmm.
They'd do an Ernest Tubb song, they'd switch over and try to sing like Ernest. And that was expected of them. Clayton didn't do that. Clayton would sing everything in his own voice. He had his own, you know, way of singing things. If he'd sing a Hank Williams song, he'd sing it like Clayton Delaney. And this kind of impressed me. I said, when I grow up, I'm just going to sing like Tom T. Hall, whatever it comes out like.
Who was in the show, or you were the only one? This was a show full of rogues. You were the only one that showed up.
Yeah, and I still catch hell for that, too. It's down in the Carolinas someplace.
Who was on the show?
George Jones and Johnny Paycheck.
And wasn't Jerry Lee Lewis on that show, too?
And I think Jerry Lee Lewis. And Tom T. Hall. So I pull up behind the place in my bus, and the place is packed. And the promoter came out and says, this show's not going to go on because there's nobody here. And you can't do, 4 hours by a 3-hour show. And these people are going to be mad and upset, so I would recommend that you just get out of town. So I got my band together.
He didn't want to pay you.
Huh?
He didn't want to pay you.
I don't know. I was glad to get out of there.
Yeah.
So my bus was the only one visible. So I pulled out, and all these people standing around looking for this big show to start, and I drove out of town. The guys that didn't show up, they didn't say anything about them. They must have had a good excuse. Their grandmother died or something. But since I was there and didn't pick, I really caught hell for that.
Let's put on tape the old dog story. What was this, 72?
This was 72. And I walked just into this little bar and to have a nightcap, just like in the song. I can still see it. The bartender was a big, heavy-set fellow. And this is another of those little things that maybe novelists and songwriters notice. He was polishing a glass. We don't know if they ever get this glass polished, but when bartenders aren't doing anything, when they're talking to you, they'll pick up a glass and take a cloth and they're wiping it. I think it's something to do with their hand. It's some kind of body language thing. He was standing there watching Ironside on TV. And this old black guy, who was kind of cleaning up the place, emptying ashtrays and things, and sat down, not at my table, right next to me, and said, how old do you think I am? And the rest of it's kind of in the song, And I'm sitting there talking to him, and, well, first of all, I said, I don't know. Because I was, I just got through with the show, and I was about half awake and kind of tired and everything. But he kept talking, and I picked up a little bar napkin and got out a pen and wrote watermelon wine on there, because he was telling me about watermelon wine. And I folded it up and put it in my jacket pocket. And the next day I was on a plane up to Atlanta everybody changed his plane to Atlanta and come to Nashville. And I got a sick bag out of the pocket and wrote Old Dogs on both sides of the sick bag, the song. Because I was looking for something and found that note in my pocket, and I said, watermelon wine. And of course, I didn't have a guitar or anything. I didn't know what the chords were, but I had the melody in my head. So then I got off the plane and went to a recording session. And I said, I got a new song, Jerry. And he said, what is it? I said, I wrote it on a plane. He said, can you read that? I said, yeah, it's my writing, So I sang Old Dogs and found the chords, and he said, let's put it down. I said, okay. Now, we didn't have the strings and all that there, we just had the basic rhythm section. And so I sang, the song was about 3 hours old when I recorded it. So I sang it. Jerry said, that's good, that's a take. So, okay. When I walked out of the studio, there was a guy standing in the lobby. If you remember Mercury's record studio, and you've been there a lot, you go out into a little hallway, then you turn left and go in another room, and that's a control room. Well, standing out in the hallway where he could hear the music was a sheet music salesman that I'd known around town. He secured all the sheet music rights to all the music. He was standing there crying. And I thought, something had happened to him. I said, man, you okay? You all right? He said, oh, no, I'm fine. But actually it was the song, because I didn't have any idea that it was any song other than just another song. I never knew one from the other. They were all sounded just alike to me until the public said, this is really a good one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a dangerous thing in the business too, because if you've got 10 songs and there's a Harper Valley or an Old Dogs or an I Love in there and you don't know it, you just keep on going and sing them all.
Well, it's probably one of the most descriptive songs you ever wrote.
Yeah, because I just wrote down what happened. I did that on a lot of occasions. I just write down exactly what happened. In fact, I didn't know until 2 years later when he said, I turned 65 about 11 months ago. He was trying to tell me he was on Social Security and he didn't need this gig. And I've heard about, in the Homecoming song, you mentioned earlier that Bear like that, I've had people tell me 5 different meanings to that song, 5 or 6. People hear it and they tell me how much it means to them and why. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm glad you like it, but that's not in that song. That's not what it's about. And some of my songs were that way. They'd like them, but for reasons that I never had any intention of putting in there.
Well, Tom, I thank you and happy birthday.
Yeah, thanks a million.